Hi everyone, welcome back to 30 Days of Symphony. I so much hope that if yesterday's installment, my introduction to Anton Bruckner's Symphony No. 4, was a discovery for you of Anton Bruckner's music, that it was one that was successful, because Bruckner, say what you like, he is not the most concise of composers, but what he has to say at the beginning of the end of the Austrian German, the Germanic late 19th century is absolutely essential to our understanding of the classical symphonic repertoire, but more important is this profoundly spiritual experience. As I was saying yesterday, it is not an exaggeration to think that if only poor Franz Schubert, the lyric genius, the great poet-composer of early 19th century Vienna, if only poor Franz Schubert, who died around his 30th birthday, which is an unbelievable thought considering what music he left us, if only Schubert had been allowed to live something approaching a normal lifespan and had lived into the later 19th century, his symphonies might well have sounded like those of Anton Bruckner. That being said, the two composers, like I was saying the other day about Brahms and Wagner, the two composers could not be more different. Schubert was this, he's eternally young because he never got much past 30, but this youthful, cosmopolitan, homosexual part of the Viennese cultural scene in the 1820s, and has a small, devoted band of followers who have recognized him for the genius that he is, especially in the realm of what the Germans call the Lieder, what we call the art song, the song for one singer and a pianist, which is kind of elevated to that realm of high art. Bruckner also had his small but devoted band of followers. Bruckner, of course, could not have been more different. The village schoolmaster who decides to become a church organist, who at 30 is made the cathedral organist of the great provincial Austrian city of Linz. By his early 40s, he has the profoundly prestigious but financially penurious post of court chapel organist in the great imperial city of Vienna. And because Bruckner, unlike Schubert, is allowed to live out a long, full life, by the time he has reached his 60s, the reputation of his music, a reputation so hard won, Bruckner working in just, a state of utter obscurity and kind of genteel poverty. By the 1880s, Bruckner, who's now a man in his 60s, finally has the official recognition he deserves. And as we were talking yesterday about his fourth symphony, which he himself calls, and again, one of these endlessly subtle but important signals that composers send to their audience, the symphony that Bruckner himself calls the romantic, which is to place him consciously in the tradition of Beethoven and Brahms. So it is then, just a few years later in 1884, we have the premiere of his Symphony No. 7. Again, the key signature is so important. The fourth symphony in that Beethovenian key of E-flat major. Remember, E-flat major is the key of Beethoven's Eroica Symphony. E-flat major being the most heroic of keys. Bruckner brings it up one notch of a semitone to E major, which is at once one of the very brightest and richest sounding of key signatures in classical music. Before I get to the symphony itself, I just want to reflect on how we have this habit in classical music of referring to or remembering great composers, especially of the kind of Central European Germanic tradition, in pairs as kind of pendants to each other. We have Bach and Handel. We have Haydn and Mozart. We have Beethoven and Schubert. We have Robert Schumann and Felix Mendelssohn. And then we have Brahms and not another German composer, but the great Bohemian composer, Brahms's friend and colleague. We always think of Brahms with Dvorak, and then we place Bruckner with Mahler, that great symphonic genius of the very beginning of the 20th century. This is incredibly idiotically inaccurate because Bruckner actually was born 10 years before Brahms. Bruckner was born in 1824, just as fate would have it, Beethoven, now in late middle age, was putting the finishing touches for the premiere of his mammoth creation, the Ninth Symphony, the choral symphony. And it's for that reason, along with others, that many, not only scholars, but critics and just general music lovers have seen Anton Bruckner above all as the inheritor of the tradition of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. He's kind of in an eternal tie with Johannes Brahms. As we were talking a few days earlier, Brahms's first symphony was commonly referred to as Beethoven's 10th. But as Austria and Germany in the later 19th century hurtled towards this ever more nationalistic, imperialistic stance. Remember, Germany is not an empire until 1871. Germany before 1871, by which I'm referring to Prussia, Bavaria, the various German lands, are this hodgepodge of this very loose confederation of dukedoms and princely states. And it's only when Otto von Bismarck takes over as Chancellor, the ruthlessly successful Chancellor of Germany, working as he is for the Kaiser Wilhelm I and later Wilhelm II, who brings Germany and Austria into World War I. Brahms's music, the figure of Brahms, the great North German kind of, if I may coin the phrase, the kind of the great liberal conservative, the progressive traditionalist, Brahms begins to be seen as a little too complicated, and Bruckner is taken on as the great national savior of Austro-German music. Here we finally have a composer who, without guilt, without complications, without remorse, the way you get those beautiful, those gorgeous complications in the music of Brahms. That's what makes it so amazing. Here we have in Bruckner an uncomplicated savior figure who's all the happier to take on that in his very naive village schoolmaster way, could not be more happy than to take on the role as the successor to Beethoven. He does this via his worshipful, kind of, I must say, embarrassingly worshipful reverence for the music of that towering operatic genius of a composer, Richard Wagner. And that's where the Seventh Symphony's composition comes into play. The Seventh Symphony is very, very much like the Fourth Symphony. Again, the E-flat major tonality is ratcheted up one half step to the very ruby rich key of E major. But again, Bruckner is, by now, he has found his groove and he has reached his kind of formula of how to write a symphony. Again, it is not Brahms's progressive, traditional, liberal, conservative, gorgeously complicated mode of developing variation where, like, the moment you present like a little 3 or 4 note idea, forget about a melody, forget about a theme, you produce this little germ, this little melodic cell, you start immediately developing it. And this is, of course, the great German tradition of traditional progressivism, this, like I keep thinking of the German word for science, Wissenschaft, this complete intellectual, always going forward. Bruckner settles into his fate, and it's a beautiful fate. It's a beautiful destiny, as taking that idea from Mozart and principally of Schubert. Schubert, where everything by Schubert, even his symphonies, everything by Schubert is a song. And you have these endlessly broad arching melodies, these broad thematic spaces that take their own sweet time to develop. And then you get to the middle of movement, and then you develop those ideas, and then you get to the end of the movement and you recapitulate them. It's in the most beautiful sense of the word, it is a simpler mode of composition. So by the Seventh Symphony, Bruckner has found his formula for how to write a symphony, and it will continue on to the very end of his career. So again, expect the massive, massive block-like 4 movements of an Austrian romantic symphony. The sonata, allegro, basically fast first movement, the songful, ballad-like adagio, I need to use an Italian term, of slow movement, the boisterous scherzo, which always bows to Beethoven. If you listen carefully, the main idea of the scherzo of the Seventh Symphony is a very thinly veiled reference to the main idea of the scherzo of Beethoven's Ninth. This dotted rhythm, dun-da-dum, bum, with this kind of dun-da-dum idea, with this octave leap. And again, Bruckner, though not remotely as sophisticated a composer as Brahms, knows exactly what he's doing by signaling that to his audience. And again, by this point, the scherzo trio scherzo form of a symphonic third movement by Bruckner, has been so grown to kind of alpine Matterhorn proportions that the scherzo itself is it's not just the scherzo trio scherzo is an ABA form, the scherzo itself is an ABA form, which also has a lot of traces of a sonata form development where he starts developing the material before he reprises it. And then we have this grand, weighty finale of which Beethoven truly would be proud. The first movement and the last movement of Bruckner 7 begin with this idea, this habit, I should say, of Bruckner, with this, which is so central to his art. Listen at the very beginning of the first movement and the last movement to this high tremolando in the violins, just this note that just way up there, that the violinists shake their bows to create this what we call a tremolo effect, this high shimmering tremolo in the violins, and then the cellos take up the main idea. This is Bruckner's stock and trade. His default mode as a composer to start a symphonic movement is with these high tremolo violins, and then the cellos, maybe also the violas, take up this broad arch-like theme. The slow movement was written literally as a memorial to Richard Wagner. While Bruckner was working on this slow movement in the early 1880s, he knew that Wagner was in his final days, and the slow movement was finished just days after Wagner's death. Now again, Bruckner, the village schoolmaster turned worshipful, cathedral organist, he has this slavish devotion to Richard Wagner. It's Wagner who gives him his start, really, by accepting the dedication of his very early, but his first work to make an impression on the international scene, his Symphony No. 3. So Bruckner, in the ultimate gesture of tribute to Wagner, for the first time in one of his symphonies, and he's really the only composer who did this, adds a chorus of Wagner tubas to the slow movement. Now, what, may you ask, is a Wagner tuba? A Wagner tuba is an instrument that was developed developed by Wagner himself to play a certain range of the brass section in his immortal tetralogy of operas, his cycle of 4 operas known as the Ring of the Nibelungs. And Wagner felt for this truly path-breaking cycle of operas, he had to invent a new instrument that was a cross between the tuba and the French horn. It had the bass-like, that profound bass-like quality of the tuba, but had the more mellow, lyrical quality of the French horn. So he had this instrument literally invented for the first performances of his operas, which we now know as his Ring cycle. So Bruckner, in this audaciously slavish gesture, incorporates a quartet of Wagner tubas into the slow movement. So the slow movement of the Symphony No. 7 literally becomes this funeral dirge for Richard Wagner. What I want you to do is completely forget about Wagner when you take in the second movement, the slow movement of the Bruckner 7th, because Bruckner leaves to the world this musical document that is so lyrically profound, is so heartbreakingly, beautifully sad, that it ultimately has nothing whatsoever to do with the time and the place and the circumstances with which it was written. And again, that's why we call it classical music. Are you wondering? Are you wondering why we call it classical music? Because it is music that has become classic, that has stood the test of time, that has survived its immediate origins of personalities, politics, time, and place. And so, you know, when you hear the Wagner tubas come and go, oh, the Wagner tubas, but otherwise, please, I beg you, forget about Richard Wagner and all that was terrible about what Wagner stood for, and just take in the eternal sadness of this music. The Scherzo, as I said, is back to boisterous Beethoven. You would think that the funeral of Richard Wagner had never occurred. And in the finale, remember the paradigm I set up with those high, shimmering, tremolando violins, and then that arch-like theme, that singing theme in the cello section. Well, if you listen carefully, that arch-like singing theme in the cello section, that's the main theme of the last movement, is basically just a sped-up version of the lyrical arching cello main theme of the first movement. So Bruckner may not have the total sophistication of Brahms's inter-movement sense of developing variation, but Bruckner, suffice it to say, was no slouch as a composer in that regard. Another work of cathedral-like genius. Again, if a great Brahms symphony is this complicated but, wow, beautifully important conversation, Bruckner is an experience of conversion, of being in some great musical sacred space. So for the hour-long span in its glorious 4 movements of Bruckner's 7th Symphony, we now enjoy one of the great recent performances of this work. Claudio Abbado, a name you might have heard. He was the man who got to, well, he got to take on the poisoned chalice of being the next music director of the Berlin Philharmonic after the, 40-year reign of the indomitable Herbert von Karajan. That's a whole story unto itself, but he was certainly one of the most beloved of conductors of the late 20th century, an Italian maestro of total musical and technical authority who was beloved also by us Midwesterners because in the 1980s he had several memorable seasons as the principal guest conductor under Sir George Schulte, of course, but the principal guest conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. He's here late in life when he was slowly but surely dying of cancer, actually, but had also, not unlike Bruckner, had developed this absolutely devoted band of followers from the finest orchestral musicians from all over the world. Here he is conducting in Switzerland at the Lucerne Festival Orchestra, Bruckner's Symphony No. 7, a cathedral in sound.